This presentation gives an introduction to Lynton IPL Technology. IPL stands for Intense Pulsed Light, and it's used to treat a wide range of quite common skin concerns such as red vessels, rosacea, hair removal, epidermal pigment, acne, and skin rejuvenation. An intense pulse of light is essentially used to heat up these things within the skin. So we call them targets or sometimes chromophores, but they're things such as the melanin in the hair and in pigmentation, the hemoglobin, the red component of the blood, and sometimes the water in the dermis if it's skin rejuvenation that we're trying to achieve. And in general, as an overview, IPL works by heating up these targets and actually damaging them so that they can be reduced or removed from the skin. So if we look at hair removal in a bit more detail, an intense pulse of light is first emitted onto the skin. And that light is actually absorbed by the target. So the hair just absorbs the light. And it changes from light energy into heat energy. And the heat actually diffuses outwards into the surrounding follicle. And what that heat does then is it actually damages and destroys the stem cells that cause hair growth. Now, there's a few things that will impact how successful your results are, namely these three things. So the wavelength, the fluence, and the pulse duration. So you've got to choose the right colour of light to begin with, and that's the wavelength of the light. Then you need the right fluence or energy, and then you need the right pulse duration to match the thermal relaxation time of the target. So if we talk through these in a bit more detail, starting with wavelength. So in order to get that target, in order to get the blood vessel or the hair to heat up, it's got to absorb the light. It's got to absorb that IPL. Now, different coloured targets will absorb different coloured lights. So red light, for example, is really easily absorbed by green, and green is really easily absorbed by red pigments. So different coloured lights will be absorbed by different coloured targets. So we choose the wavelength that we know the target in the tissue is going to absorb. Now, wavelengths are measured in nanometers, and for Lynton IPLs, we emit typically between 550 to 1100. So essentially, an IPL is actually delivering lots of different wavelengths. But then we use a filter to filter out the particular wavelength that we want for any given treatment. So what you can see here is an IPL handpiece, a Lynton handpiece. And where it says Lynton and 585 in the middle there, behind that, what you've got is the flash lamp. Now the flash lamp is just generating that white light. So lots of different wavelengths between 600 and 1000. And what we then do is we use the filter in there to actually give us just the specific colours of light that we want. So this particular handpiece is filtering out so that we can deliver 585 light. And we have another handpiece which delivers 650 nanometers. So the 650 nanometer wavelength handpiece is for hair removal and skin rejuvenation. And the 585 handpiece is for vascular, pigmented lesions and for acne. So once you've got the right wavelength, so you know that you're going to get good absorption from either the blood or the hair or the acne, perhaps, depending on what you're treating, then you need to think about, well, what's the fluence? What is the energy level to use? So the fluence is measured in joules per centimetre squared. And it's a measure, like I say, of how much energy you're actually putting into the target to heat it up. For example, you might use 5 joules per centimetre squared, you might use 20 joules per centimetre squared. It just completely depends on what it is that you're trying to treat. Obviously, if you use a very low fluence, you'll find it difficult to get a result. And if you use a fluence that's too high, you are at risk of overheating the skin. So fluence choices is important. But the third factor, which is really important with IPL, is also the pulse duration. So the pulse duration refers to how quickly you actually put that energy into the skin. So you can deliver 20 joules really fast, or you can deliver that light a little bit more slowly. Now, the faster you heat something, the more aggressive that is, and the slower you heat it, the more gentle that is. And a good way to think about this is, if you take a cold bottle, a glass bottle, up to 100 degrees C really quickly, so you just pour in boiling water and you heat it really quickly, there's a risk that that glass will shatter. Whereas if you take a cold bottle and put cold water in there and slowly heat it to 100 degrees C, it's much less likely that that glass will shatter. And that's because it's had time for some thermal diffusion of the heat around the actual glass bottle. So you're less likely to heat it in such an aggressive way that it will cause any fragmenting of that glass. So how do you know? How do you know whether to choose to heat something up quickly or to do it nice and slowly? Well, it depends on what we call the thermal relaxation time of the target. So the thermal relaxation time is a measure of how quickly something's going to cool down. So typically, thick hairs and vessels hold their heat really well. And so they have what we call a long thermal relaxation time. That means they don't cool down very quickly, targets like this. They hold their heat really well. So when you apply the IPL, that thick dark vessel will absorb the light really easily. It will hold onto it for a long time. So this kind of target has a long thermal relaxation time. So we choose a long pulse duration to match that so that we get a good result. What that means is that over time, the heat will just diffuse nicely out into the surrounding area and will destroy those stem cells. Thin hairs and thin vessels, they actually lose their heat really quickly. And so they have a short thermal relaxation time. There isn't a lot of, because this hair or this vessel will cool down so quickly, there's really not a lot of time for heat spread in the surrounding area. So we can't heat it too gently, we can't heat it too slowly, because the heat will just dissipate too quickly. So they don't hold their heat very well. They have a short thermal relaxation time. They cool down quickly. So we need a short pulse duration to get a good result. If we heat this up all in one go, really fast, then it will mean that the heat can just diffuse out to the area around the follicle to destroy those stem cells. So short pulses are good for very thin hairs with not a lot of melanin content in, and very thin vessels. Long pulses are more suitable when you've got thick dark hairs, perhaps when you've got a darker skin where you want to deliver the heat in a much more gentler way. Another thing that's important to think about when you're looking at IPL technology is, what's the pulse sequence like? Is there a lot of flexibility in the pulses that I can deliver? Pulse sequencing is all about protecting against any epidermal damage. So lots of IPLs on the market, quite low quality IPLs, they only give you the option to deliver the light, deliver that intense pulse of light in just one pulse. And there's a problem with that, because it can mean that you are quite restricted in your fluence. You can't always achieve high fluences with this. Also, it can be quite restrictive because sometimes you want to allow the skin to cool a little bit before you apply another pulse of light. So a pulse sequence from a Lynton IPL involves pulsing a little bit of light onto the skin and then stopping. And you have what's called a pulse delay. And in that pulse delay, the skin cools down, but the hair stays hot, or the vessel stays hot. Then we put another pulse of light on, the skin cools again, another pulse of light, and the skin cools again. So with Lynton IPL, you can actually deliver quite a range of different pulse sequences. So the first pulse is emitted, and what that means is that the melanin is heated up both in the skin and the hair, because the skin doesn't know, the IPL doesn't know what to heat up. It doesn't know the difference between skin and hair. It's just absorbed by melanin and heats up melanin. So if you've got a white skin and a dark hair, that's fine. You'll get much more absorption in the hair than you will do in the skin. But when you've got a skin and hair type where they perhaps contain quite similar levels of melanin, it becomes really important to make sure that you only heat the hair and you don't heat the skin. So the first pulse will heat both things, but because the skin has a short thermal relaxation time, that will cool down quickly. Hairs typically have longer thermal relaxation times than the skin, so they'll hold their heat a little bit better. So the first pulse comes along, heats up skin and the hair, and then we allow it to cool down. So that delay in the pulse sequence is letting the epidermis, the skin, actually cool down. We then put another pulse of light in, and because the hair had retained that heat, the hair now gets even hotter. But again, the skin is allowed to cool down. Another pulse of light goes in, the hair gets even hotter, but the skin again is allowed to cool. So the epidermis hasn't reached a temperature where it's damaged at all. The skin is in great condition, but the hair has been getting hotter and hotter with each pulse. And that allows us to create very, very selective heating of that follicle just to kill the stem cells in that area and leave the skin in great condition. If you don't have that ability and you have a machine that can only do singular pulses, then you've got a very small temperature differential between the target and the epidermis. So the target here, for example, the hair, is the pink line, and the skin is the blue line. There's not much difference in how you heat them if you just heat in one pulse. The problem with that is you can either fall just under the damage threshold, so you probably won't get a good result. You won't have heated the hair enough to destroy it, or you overshoot it. You take both into the damage threshold and you can end up with an adverse reaction where you've overheated the skin. The beauty of a pulse sequence where you deliver a train of pulses is in the first pulse, you heat both things, the target and the epidermis, but they cool down at different rates. So the skin gets nice and cold, but the hair stays warm. We do another pulse of light, and again, during that pulse delay, epidermis cools down faster than the hair. We do another pulse, and we've now got a nice large temperature differential between the skin and the hair. So we can clearly and easily put the hair into the damage threshold and the skin remains way below that. So we have a very, very safe treatment. The beauty of a Lynton IPL is that you have a lot of control over this pulse sequence. So you can choose to deliver 2 pulses, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can alter the delays in between those pulses, so making them more gentle or more aggressive. And there are presets to enable you to do super short pulses or longer pulses in order to treat exactly the condition that you have in front of you, which gives you really complete flexibility in your treatments. Most IPLs are actually okay at treating hair removal where you've got quite dark hairs on nice light skins. Actually, with single pulses, you can get an okay result on that, and they're fairly easy to treat. But where you start to find most IPLs really struggle is in the more difficult skin concerns. So this is things like when the hair becomes really thin and really fine, it doesn't have a lot of melanin content in it. When the vessels become very, very thin, so thin telangiectasia, facial vessels, and even rosacea, where you've just got flushing and blushing and you can't actually see a vessel, most IPLs really struggle with that. Now, the Lynton IPL allows you to totally customize between high or low energies, between short and long pulse sequences, so that you can actually excel on all of these really difficult to treat things. You can deliver extremely safe treatments on darker skins and really highly highly results orientated, ultra high powers on those more difficult conditions. So not all IPL systems are the same, and you certainly get much better results from IPLs that allow you to vary the pulse durations, but also have good control over your fluence and have good control over your wavelength as well. If you have any questions from today's presentations, please feel free to drop me an email or call me on my mobile number, as you can see here. Thank you.